discussion you are about to hear may be startling to most of you, but its importance to every freedom-loving and patriotic American is without question. For we are well on our way to losing the sovereignty and the independence of this great nation. My name is Charles Armour. I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of the John Birch Society. It is my hope that you will take the time to consider the facts that I am about to present. For our freedom and the freedom of future generations is at stake. Early in 1987, just after he had been named to the extremely important post of Speaker of the House of Representatives, Congressman Jim Wright of Texas made an official visit to the Soviet Union. While there, he appeared on Soviet state-controlled television and offered viewers a lapel pin displaying crossed U.S. and USSR flags. His offer was passed along to Americans by U.S. media representatives. As a result, Speaker Wright began receiving letters asking for the pins. He responded by sending them out as part of what he called a symbol of peace and friendship. At the very time Mr. Wright was encouraging U.S.-Soviet peace and friendship, the Soviet Union was in its 8th year of its bloody invasion of neighboring Afghanistan. Soviet troops were maintaining their 40-year domination of Central and Eastern Europe. Soviet supplies and money were keeping Castro and the Sandinista communists afloat in Cuba and Nicaragua. Over 100,000 American families were still grieving over sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers killed by Soviet-backed communist forces in Korea and Vietnam. Soviet-backed terrorists and revolutionaries were busily spreading unrest in Africa, and the tax bills of Americans included spending $300 billion per year for defense against a Soviet threat. Other than the President himself, the Speaker of the House is the most powerful elected individual in our nation. Mr. Wright's placement of Old Glory beside communism's hammer and sickle on a lapel pin and his distribution of it both in the Soviet Union and the United States surely delighted Soviet officials. But it had to be a cruel blow to the average Russian who hopes that America might somehow deliver him from communist oppression. And it most assuredly was an insult to the United States and to the Americans worthy of the name. Is Speaker Wright unaware of the consequences of his act? Is he ignorant of the barbaric record of the Soviet Union? Despite its many public relation ploys, the USSR has not changed. Witness the final statement in Soviet leader Gorbachev's 3-hour speech in Moscow on November 2nd, 1987. Celebrating 70 years of communist rule in Russia, he closed his remarks with,
"In October 1917, we parted with the old world, rejecting it once and for all. We are moving toward a new world, the world of communism. We shall never turn off that road."
It ought to be obvious to anyone that the type of peace sought by Mikhail Gorbachev is total victory for communism. The peace he is seeking can be achieved only if all nations, including ours, either surrender to or merge with the Soviet Union. Gorbachev knows this. The Czechs, the Poles, the Cubans, the Latvians, and millions more know it. And any realistic American knows the simple truth is that the Soviets have no intention of backing down from their goal to rule the world. Mr. Wright's lapel pin showing the cross U.S. and USSR flags spells grave danger for America. But so too do many official policies of the U.S. government, especially those involving aid to and trade with communist tyrannies. Let's take a look at what these aid and trade policies have accomplished. In 1969, the U.S. government permitted France to sell America's silicone microchip technology to communist Poland, a totally dominated Soviet satellite. Miniature integrated circuits produced in Poland were soon being used in newer classes of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. In 1972, largely as a result of the efforts of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, The U.S. government authorized the sale of 164 precision ball-bearing grinders to the Soviet Union. These unique machines, manufactured only in America, produce the ball bearings with the remarkable precise specifications needed in space weaponry. Once in possession of this vital technological capability, the Soviets were able to MIRV their missile. That is, place many independently targeted warheads atop a single missile. In 1978, the Soviet Union had obtained such advanced computers as the Cyber 73 from Control Data Corporation and the IBM 370. Specific exemptions to existing controls had been granted by U.S. officials to allow delivery of this strategically important equipment. Acquisition of just these three items, silicone microchips, precision ball-bearing grinders, and advanced computers, has given the USSR both a first strike capability for its nuclear weapons and a missile defense system capable of neutralizing our own weapons. Attempts to overcome these key Soviet advances have cost United States taxpayers an additional $20 to $30 billion per year in defense spending, and will cost far more if current plans for a space-based defense system are carried out. Not only has the U.S. government cooperated strategically in arming the menacing adversary, it has also allowed the communists to obtain much of the equipment and technology it could not get elsewhere. As Senator William Armstrong of Colorado stated it in an important speech to the Senate on April 13, 1982,
"It is hard to put a price tag on the additional burden heaped on our taxpayers by our reckless trade policies with the Soviet Union. But if it were not for these policies, we likely would not need the MX missile or the B-1 bomber to counter Soviet weapons we helped the Russians build." In the last 10 years alone, the United States and other Western nations have sold to the Soviet Union and its satellites more than $50 billion worth of sophisticated equipment the communists could not produce themselves. This equipment has been used to produce nuclear missiles, tanks and armored cars, military command and control systems, spy satellites, and air defense radars. In addition, the Soviets have been able to purchase entire factories designed and built by Western engineers and financed in large part by American and Western European banks. Much of the production of these factories is devoted to the manufacture of military transport, ammunition, and other logistical items for the Soviet war machine. It is difficult to overstate the extent to which the West has contributed to the military threat that now endangers our very existence.
We intend to dwell in this program on the many and varied ways the U.S. government has assisted communism, not just with money and goods, but with help in the diplomatic, political, cultural, and psychological arenas as well. The extent of this aid over many decades is one of the best-kept secrets of our time. We shall examine policies that have enabled communist rulers to gain control of many nations, subjugate more than 1 billion human beings, and wage relentless war against what remains of the free world. We shall also analyze the stream of reasons offered to justify this assistance, as well as take a hard look at the more fundamentally treacherous policy guiding U.S. leaders. That is even less known than the details about monetary aid and the transfer of goods. Finally, we shall recommend a course of action for the American people, a plan that we are not alone in hoping will lead to a marked change in our government's attitude toward communism and toward the continued existence of our free and independent nation. We begin, however, with a needed look at the reality of communism. If it is true that several past generations of Americans possessed a vivid awareness of the horrors of communism, it is also true that today this awareness has largely been dulled. The communism that was once popularly and officially known as a criminal conspiratorial force that would spare no evil in its drive to gain and maintain power has gradually come to be viewed merely as a different but legitimate system with which we must have diplomatic, economic, and even cultural ties. Unfortunately, what has changed is the attitude of the American people, not the reality of communist barbarism. Communism can be seen today in the Berlin Wall, the mass murder of the Cambodian people, the thousands of gulags and political prisons in the Soviet Union, the invasion and rape of Afghanistan, the forced abortion policies of Red China, the training and use of terrorists throughout the world, and so much more. Communism is total power. It is the seizure of the reins of government by a few who, with utter ruthlessness, impose their will on the many. Because it is so contrary to all normal human aspirations, communist power can only be maintained through police-state terror, fortified borders, destruction of religion, and suppression of all freedom. When the people of the Ukraine resisted communist domination in the 1930s, a man-made famine killed 10 million and forced those who survived to submit. When Stalin wanted to consolidate his power, he murdered millions in Russia itself. When the people of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, and elsewhere began to flee from communist control, up went the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall to keep them enslaved. And later, when freedom-loving Hungarians, Czechs, and Poles tried to revolt against communist rule, they were brutally crushed. All of this is the reality of communism. And it is a reality that exists today, not only in the past, but in the present. In a 1971 report, the United States Senate Internal Security Subcommittee estimated that the Soviet communists had murdered as many as 45 million of their own people. In another report that same year, the same Senate subcommittee estimated the Chinese communists, beginning in 1947, had killed as many as 64 million Chinese. More slaughter accompanied communist takeovers in Cuba, Algeria, Rhodesia, and Vietnam. Approximately 3 million of Cambodia's 7 million were exterminated when communists took control of that nation in 1975. This is more the reality of communism. Without provocation, the Soviets established a puppet government in neighboring Afghanistan in 1979. Tens of thousands of Soviet troops were sent across the border to sustain and consolidate communist power. In the incredibly cruel war they have waged against courageous native resistance, over 1 million Afghans have died. Another 4 million have fled to other countries, and countless numbers have been maimed, many of them children, whose limbs and eyes have been blown away by Soviet booby-trapped toys. The reality of communism includes the brutal seizure of power, confiscation of property, enslavement of countless numbers of human beings, mass killings, manufactured starvation, excruciating tortures, and a vast network of prisons and slave labor camps. For sheer horror, communists stand second to none over the long course of mankind's history. Yet America has aided and continues to aid this monstrous evil force. Under the communist socialist system created by Karl Marx, government regulates, controls, taxes, and constricts its workers so completely that incentive to work is destroyed. Left alone, communism would fall of its own dead weight, a complete and utter failure. There are important questions about communism, therefore, that must be asked. How has its self-defeating socialist system successfully seized more than 200 nations and 1/3 of the world's people? How does an economic system that is a complete failure continue to grow stronger and more menacing? How is communism able to continue suppressing hundreds of millions who despise it and would flee if they could? How can the Soviet Union afford a military force that occupies Central and Eastern Europe, threatens Western Europe, invades Afghanistan, supplies and trades armies in Cuba and Nicaragua, foments revolution in Africa, and even boasts a missile capability that is equal to our own? The single answer to all of these questions is that communism receives help in all of its treacherous endeavors from the non-communist world, chiefly from the government of the United States. Whatever else can be said about this aid, there is an important fundamental point that cannot be made too often. It is that helping communist regimes has always been and continues to be morally wrong. Treating them with dignity cannot be justified. Overlooking their treachery is wrong. Earning profits by supplying them with equipment, technology, and credit only compounds the problem. And appeasing them with fawning smiles and pleas of peace only strengthens their resolve to continue ravaging the planet. To continue, as Gorbachev has stated, striving toward a world of communism. The documented pattern of the U.S. government aid to communism must be broken. It began with the critical diplomatic help to top communist revolutionary Leon Trotsky by President Woodrow Wilson and his closest advisor, Edward Mandell House. This aid enabled Trotsky to join with Lenin to complete the communist conquest of Russia in 1917. It continued with 700,000 tons of American foodstuff worth $90 million given to the communist government in the 1920s and promptly used by the Reds to consolidate their power. Another major boost for the Soviet Union came in 1933 with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's extension of diplomatic recognition, legitimacy, and credit that saved communism once again. Then in a program begun before U.S. entry into World War II, $12 billion worth of U.S. Lend-Lease first saved the Soviets from destruction and then started them on the way to becoming a world power. At the close of World War II in 1945, the entire communist world consisted of less area and fewer captives than the single nation called the USSR can claim today. The Soviet Union was broke. Much of its industry had been destroyed during the Nazi invasion. Its people hated the communist system, and for many reasons the USSR was an unlikely threat to the rest of the world. But look at the Soviet Union now. From a devastated nation whose imposed socialistic stagnation has destroyed productivity and guaranteed shortages of everything but police state terror, the USSR has, in a few decades, conquered more than 40 nations, spread its sinister influence to the far corners of the globe, and built a military machine that threatens the entire planet. How could this happen? How did the communists seize much of Europe and China and gain solid footholds in Africa and even in the Western Hemisphere? Even more, still saddled with the same incentive-destroying socialist system and intensely hated by those it has made captive. How is it that the Soviet Union is able to maintain control over so many nations, and how is it able to press ahead with programs to subvert and conquer what remains of the free world? As we have already stated, the answer to all of these questions is that the communists have received help from non-communists. They have been the recipients of military, economic, diplomatic, political, cultural, and psychological assistance from governments that are their targets. It is certainly true that they have practiced deception, fraud, thievery, blackmail, and every other crime imaginable in order to conquer the other lands and maintain those conquests. But the willingness of the Western leaders, especially those of the United States, to ignore these crimes and to continue to build communist power suggests something far more sinister than gullibility and stupidity. The post-World War II years saw our nation disarm and return to peacetime pursuits. But those same years saw communism conquer much of Europe and the vast nation of China. Assistance to communism in the form of equipment and supplies was now being augmented by vital diplomatic help. No less an authority than U.S. Ambassador to Poland Arthur Bliss Lane tried to tell fellow Americans that Poland didn't so much fall in 1947 as she was pushed into communist hands by officials of the United States government. His 1948 book, I Saw Poland Betrayed, detailed the incredible story, but his book was smothered, became extremely hard to find, and hardly created a ripple. Additional revelations later showed that the same pattern had been followed to push Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia into communist hands. The fall of China in 1949 demonstrated even more clearly that U.S. diplomacy was being administered by individuals who favored communism against the express wishes of General Douglas MacArthur. Soviet Russia had been welcomed into the war against Japan only a few weeks before the Japanese surrendered. For that gesture, the Soviets were given occupation rights over the Manchurian region of China, where the huge supplies of Japanese war material were stored. All of that bonanza was quickly transferred by the Soviets to the Chinese communists, who used it to attack our nationalist Chinese allies led by Chiang Kai-shek. As the civil war in China intensified, U.S. leaders demanded Chiang form a coalition government with the communists, a move he knew would be suicidal. He refused, and immediately all American aid was terminated. Chiang had tanks but no gasoline. He had troops and guns but no ammunition. He had the will to resist communism, but the ally he had relied upon, the United States, had taken away his ability to fight. In desperation, he fled with his government and the remnant of his forces to Taiwan, and the huge nation of China fell into the hands of the bloodiest murders the world had ever known. This immense tragedy prompted a young Massachusetts congressman to denounce U.S. policies regarding China. In 1949, John F. Kennedy was absolutely correct when he stated,
"Our policy in China has reaped the whirlwind. The continuing insistence that aid would not be forthcoming unless a coalition government with the communists was formed was a crippling blow to the nationalist government. This is the tragic story of China, whose freedom we once fought to preserve. What our young men have saved, our diplomats and our president have frittered away."
One of the authors of U.S. policy that betrayed Chiang Kai-shek in the late 1940s was a State Department official named Dean Rusk. But in 1961, President John Kennedy named that same Dean Rusk to be our nation's Secretary of State. Unfortunately, it was Kennedy, not Rusk, whose attitude had changed. Communist conquests in Europe and Asia and a growing awareness of the complicity of U.S. officials in those conquests prompted the American people to begin wondering about our own leaders. The conduct of the Korean War from 1950 until 1953 raised more apprehension about America's leadership. There, for the first time, American troops found themselves engaged in combat against communist forces. But there was no declaration of war, and victory was never the goal. The war that had been brilliantly won by MacArthur's forces in its early days had been converted into a deadly stalemate. Unprecedented restrictions on our own forces were ordered from on high, and MacArthur himself was removed from command for wanting victory. Out of the Korean War, Red China emerged as the most powerful military force in Asia, and United States influence in that region declined sharply. Because the communist progress we are detailing could not have been accomplished without the vital help of U.S. diplomats, congressional investigatory bodies began probing evidence of loyalty and security lapses among high government officials. The House Committee on Un-American Activities, led by men like Congressman Francis Walter of Pennsylvania, exposed some of the treachery. The Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, led by Indiana Senator William Jenner, concluded that there were 4 communist cells operating within our government, and that only 2 had been exposed. Sad to say, the others never have been exposed. Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy publicly exposed more than 100 individuals who, while working for the United States government, were also helping the communist cause. Despite incredible propaganda to the contrary, in none of those cases were his actions ever shown to have been unjust. But after McCarthy had been hounded to his death, many of the persons who had resigned or been removed from government positions because of his efforts were welcomed back to their post. And then all of this once formidable internal security apparatus was done away with. Today there is no Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, no House Committee on Un-American Activities, no Subversive Activities Control Board, and no Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. And Supreme Court decisions have made it possible for communists to serve in our military, work in our defense plants, and teach in our schools. Without such help, red progress would likely never have been possible. But while the motive of those who aid communists is to have them take control of some nation, a related and more comprehensive goal is to have the threat of communism force the remaining free peoples of the world to sacrifice their nation's sovereignty to a world government. The not-so-hidden plan calls for simultaneously taking all the steps toward world government and then creating a universal new world order under the framework of the United Nations or some other all-powerful central governing body. That world government would then rule the planet in much the same way that the masters of the Kremlin rule the captive people in the Soviet Union today. What about a world government? Or as the increasingly heard phrase puts it, a new world order. Is this necessarily a bad thing? Might it possibly serve the cause of peace? If there were a United Nations empowered to enforce peace, wouldn't that be desirable? The only way to answer these questions is to reflect for a moment on what changes would have to be made in America in order to create this world government. The very first change would require that the United States renounce or at least ignore the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. Not only would the independence portions of each have to be cast aside, the references in the Declaration to man's creator, nature's God, and divine providence would have to be suppressed. After all, communist governments reject such notions, and they are not going to change. Nor should anyone expect change in the United Nations that also has no place for God. Next, the limitations on government power that were so carefully formulated in the United States Constitution could no longer stand. It's true that many of these constitutional reins have already been broken, but under a world government, only its rules shall be allowed, and not even the potential for any other kind of government system could exist. Then the wealth of the American people would have to be redistributed. There would be, of course, some individuals who would be dissatisfied with the political and economic consequences of world government. In order to keep any of them from creating any problems, there would have to be restrictions on speaking out, publishing, conducting meetings, and even moving about from place to place. World government would also mean that the military force of any consequence would be the one possessed by the world government, and it would be used to enforce peace, of course. While this seemingly desirable situation is developing, everyone will be asked to forget that a world government possessing enough military power to enforce peace would also have enough military power to enforce global tyranny. Ladies and gentlemen, it is inconceivable that any American would sacrifice our nation's sovereignty to such a nightmare. But not only have millions been persuaded that a world government is necessary, practically all of the specific steps to build one are being taken right now. Just think. God is being driven out of any institution touched by government. The Constitution limitations on federal power are consistently ignored. Our nation has been committed to scores of international alliances, pacts, and commissions. American wealth, jobs, and industries are being transferred overseas. And the average standard of living has either declined or wives and mothers have had to work to keep pace. Government at all levels takes so much in taxes from the American people that in many households, the paycheck of one spouse keeps the family going, while the paycheck of the other is used to satisfy growing tax bills. In the process, the family is the casualty, and American children in particular suffer in many ways. Isn't it time for Americans to take stock of where we are being taken? Isn't it time that we realize that it is not the Russians or the Chinese or the Cubans who are radically changing our nation? Older Americans will remember a man named Alger Hiss, a former State Department official, advisor to President Roosevelt at the 1945 Yalta Conference, and architect of the United Nations. Hiss was publicly exposed in 1948 as having been a Soviet spy for over a decade. But at the time he was exposed, he was serving as the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This huge tax-exempt foundation was funding such groups as the Institute of Pacific Relations that played such an important role in undermining Chiang Kai-shek, the Council on Foreign Relations that had been working for a goal of one world government since 1921, and other organizations that were busily generating support and enhancing the power of the United Nations. By 1952, many of the activities of the Carnegie, Ford, and Rockefeller Foundations, among others, had become so blatantly left-wing that Congress decided to look beyond the government agencies it was investigating and probe these private foundations as well. In 1982, author and television producer G. Edward Griffin interviewed a man named Norman Dodd at his home in Virginia. Mr. Dodd had been a key member of the staff of the Reese Committee formed by the Congress in 1953 to investigate the tax-exempt foundations. As he had often done over the years, Mr. Dodd recounted the shocking details of his 1953 conversation with Ford Foundation President H. Rowan Gaither.
Rowan Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither had sent for me when I found it convenient to be in New York, asked me to call upon him at his office, which I did. And on arrival, after a few amenities, Mr. Gaither said, "Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves." And before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, "Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know." Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, "Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union." Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair. I of course, didn't, but my response to Mr. Gaither then was, "Oh, Mr. Gaither, I can now answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you just told me."
During his interview, Mr. Dodd discussed the evidence his staff had uncovered, showing that the Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, and Guggenheim foundations were successfully undermining America's educational system. But he also touched on powerful enemies from within the Republican National Committee and the White House, who did everything they could to stop the investigation.
Both the Republican National Committee and the White House were resorted to stop me from continuing this investigation in the direction that Carol Reese had personally asked me to do, which was to utilize this investigation, Mr. Griffin, to uncover the fact that this country had been the victim of a conspiracy. That was Mr. Reese's conviction. I eventually agreed to carry it out.
But the Reese Committee's enemies were successful and the committee's work was terminated. No formal investigation of these foundations has ever again been conducted. Merge the United States with the Soviet Union? Do so under directives emanating from the White House? Such an incredible scheme could be accomplished only if the United States were pushed towards socialism and the Soviet Union were massively built up. There would also have to be a remarkable propaganda effort in America to destroy American people's spirit of independence and to overcome the strong anti-communist and anti-socialist sentiment existing in this country. In 1953, such a subversive goal seemed completely unattainable, and Norman Dodd must have created more doubts about himself than about the head of the Ford Foundation when he tried to warn many Americans about what he had been told. Yet it was only a few years later, in what was labeled anti-communist activity, that the United States government began to supply industrial and military equipment to Communist Poland and Communist Yugoslavia. Americans were told that we could fracture the Communist empire, even while Yugoslavian dictator Tito was publicly standing shoulder to shoulder with Moscow. Anything given to a Soviet satellite nation goes only to its government, of course. And whatever these nations acquire has always immediately become available for transfer to the Soviet Union. There's no mystery here. But few dared to challenge this new form of anti-communism. The rulers of the Kremlin must have laughed themselves silly. Nikita Khrushchev himself was later to express his utter contempt for the average American by remarking, quote, "If you spit in an American's face, he thinks it's due." End of quote. The problem is that America's politicians, media luminaries, university professors, clergymen, and others keep telling us the spit is due. It was during the Eisenhower years that the fiction of mellowing communism was begun. In 1955, our president sat at a table in Geneva with Soviet dictator Khrushchev. And in 1959, he welcomed the bloody-handed butcher of the Ukraine to the United States. The start of what was called peaceful coexistence gave the leaders of the Kremlin tremendous legitimacy and paved the way for future moves that would build up the communists and tear down the United States, so that a merger and the eventual world government could be accomplished. In 1957, shortly after the Soviet Union brutally crushed the Hungarian revolt, the Soviets startled the world by launching the first man-made orbiting satellite. It was called Sputnik. Suddenly, the American people were told that the backward Soviets weren't so backward anymore. We were assured that they had forged ahead of the United States scientifically. Furious activity in the United States was spawned by Sputnik, much of it amounting to huge federal intervention in the field of education. Anyone who cares to do so can trace the tragic decline of American schooling to this period. As more federal money and more federal control have dominated the schools, the quality of education has plummeted. The dismal performance of America's schools has become obvious to virtually everyone. The boost in prestige for the USSR supplied by Sputnik was enormous. And the shock it produced supplied the excuse not only for a massive federal presence in education, but for higher taxes, greatly expanded government spending, unbalanced budget, huge federal indebtedness, far more centralization of power in Washington, and a striking increase in the willingness of the American people to appease rather than oppose communism. 9 years later, however, it became known that our own government had forbidden United States scientists to launch our own orbiting satellite prior to the Soviet launch. General James M. Gavin had been the leader of the U.S. Army's research and development programs. In a speech given in 1966 in Boston and reported in this newspaper article, he told of his certainty that our space scientists at Huntsville, Alabama's Redstone Arsenal could have orbited a satellite a full year before the Soviets launched Sputnik. He stated that at the time he, quote, made several entreaties to the Department of Defense seeking authority to launch a satellite, and shortly thereafter I was given a written order forbidding me to do so, end of quote. He also stated that he knew of the Soviet capability to put a satellite in space months before they succeeded in doing so. In other words, orders from high U.S. officials made sure that the Soviets would be first. The benefits derived from Sputnik for the Soviets and for those who wanted to merge the United States and the USSR should never be underestimated. It was only a few years after Sputnik, and only 5 years after Rowan Gaither uttered his remarkable statement to Norman Dodd, that the U.S. State Department supplied another tremendous boost to communist prestige and another body blow to America. The occasion was the transfer of power in Cuba to Fidel Castro. Two successive ambassadors to Havana, Arthur Gardner and Earl E.T. Smith, both of whom served during Castro's rise to power, had supplied their superiors in Washington with full particulars about the bearded revolutionary's long career as a communist. Gardner was removed from his post for his efforts, and Smith was ignored. During the 1960s, the slogan used to justify helping communism was bridge building. The overall plan to compromise U.S. sovereignty in favor of world government continued, and Rowan Gaither's private admission was now eclipsed by related pronouncements from those who would sit in the very topmost seats of power in our nation. In 1960, a man named Walt Rostow wrote a book entitled The United States in the World Arena. In it, he stated,
"It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this residual right is the root of national sovereignty, it is, therefore, an American interest to see an end to nationhood as it has been historically defined."
A short time later, Mr. Rostow accepted President Kennedy's appointment as the leader of the State Department's Policy Planning Division. The 1960s, of course, also saw the U.S. get bogged down in Vietnam. In another undeclared war that numerous high-ranking military officers openly and repeatedly insisted could have been won in a matter of weeks. But more restrictions, even worse than those imposed on our men in Korea, totally contradicted all the lessons of military history and ensured that an American victory would not be achieved. One of the architects of America's losing strategy in that war was our Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. On February 26, 1966, while hundreds of Americans were dying each week in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, Mr. McNamara testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Some senators wanted to know why we weren't winning. So too did our generals and our admirals and foot soldiers. But here is McNamara's answer.
To declare war would add a new psychological element to the international situation, since in this century, declarations of war have come to imply dedication to the total destruction of the enemy. It would increase the danger of misunderstanding our true objectives.
Though we fail to state what these true objectives were, it is perfectly obvious that his goal was not to defeat communism in Southeast Asia or anywhere else. But if his objectives included helping communists to dominate all of Southeast Asia, softening up the American people's will to resist, and inducing them to believe that communist power had grown while American power had decreased, the way he and others forced our military to conduct the war was a grand success. Along with victory-denying restrictions on our military, President Johnson, in October of 1966, ordered increased aid and special treatment for the Soviet Union, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Mongolia, Poland, and Romania. But these were the suppliers of North Vietnam, then engaged in war with American troops. Hundreds of Americans were being killed every week and it was no secret that aid was flowing to North Vietnam from the USSR and its European satellites. On October 27, 1966, the New York Times reported, quote,
"The Soviet Union and its allies agreed at the conference of their leaders in Moscow last week to grant North Vietnam assistance in material and money amounting to about $1 billion. Poland's contribution will be $30 million.
North Vietnam's premier boasted in 1965, "We shall defeat the Americans with Soviet weapons." He could just as easily have stated that the job would be accomplished because America had supplied the money and the materials. The Soviet Union was indeed North Vietnam's main supplier. In the election year of 1968, the help given by the Kremlin to the Communist allies became an issue. Candidate Richard Nixon addressed the annual convention of the American Legion in New Orleans on September 12th, just prior to the elections of 1968. He declared that there should be no trade with any nation, including the Soviet Union, that, quote, aids the enemy in Vietnam, end of quote. His remarks were greeted with enthusiastic applause, and he won a close election. No sooner had he taken office in 1969, however, than President Nixon announced plans to expand trade with the Soviet Union's satellites. As the United States eased the Soviet Union's burden in keeping its satellite nations afloat, the USSR itself was able to divert more of its resources to North Vietnam, and it did so increasingly throughout the war. The poster you see asks why. If the Soviet Union were the principal supplier of the guns and the bullets that were killing American servicemen, why were we aiding the Soviet bloc of nations? No answer ever came from the administration. By 1970, over 1.7 million Americans signed this petition to Congress to stop U.S. assistance to communist nations. Packages containing 20,000 signatures to a congressman and 50,000 signatures to a senator were delivered to over 60 members of the Congress. But the effort expended was not enough, and the aid to communists grew larger. So did the casualty reports from Vietnam. All during the war, our forces were handcuffed, even worse than they had been in the Korean War. They could shoot, but not until they were shot at. They could not attack enemy sanctuaries or strategic targets. They could fight, but not win. The only obvious advantage the communists had during this war was manpower. Yet our politicians and diplomats forced our men in uniform to fight the war on communist terms, ignoring MacArthur's stern and sensible warning never to be involved in a land war in Asia. By 1972, President Nixon had dropped all pretense of anti-communism. On October 18th, he signed the official determination shown here. It says,
I hereby determine that it is in the national interest for the Export-Import Bank of the United States to guarantee, insure, extend credit, and participate in the extension of credit in connection with the purchase or lease of any product or service by, for use in, or for sale or lease to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, in accordance with Section 2B2 of the Export-Import Bank Act of 1945 as amended.
Very few Americans ever saw this document, and Richard Nixon was overwhelmingly re-elected 3 weeks later, winning 49 out of the 50 states. It cannot be stressed too emphatically that the Export-Import Bank is a United States government agency totally funded with tax money taken from the American people. It dispenses its funds to foreign governments to give them the capability of purchasing American goods. For decades, communist nations have benefited from this incredible arrangement. The war in Vietnam finally ended in 1973. The United States lost. South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were quickly engulfed in communist savagery. The toll of death and misery in those three nations is indescribable. But the Vietnam War brought many horrible consequences to the United States as well. Over 50,000 Americans were killed. Over 300,000 Americans were wounded. Our military leadership was converted from men who were winners to men who are accommodators. More government, always more government with war. Moral decline, especially among the young. A huge increase in federal indebtedness. A sharp division of our people. A marked loss of patriotism among those who never realized that everything about the Vietnam War was a perversion of the American system, and a spreading conviction that communism can't be beaten, must be further appeased, and should even be merged with our nation under some supranational authority. The war in Vietnam was an immense tragedy that in no way reflects on the brave men who went there to fight. The war could have been won in a matter of weeks, but it was years before it finally ended. And so, to the why in the poster must be added the question. Why was there a Vietnam War in the first place? Could all of its horrible consequences actually have been sought by individuals who shared the merger plans enunciated by Rowan Gaither? Could it have been planned in such a way as to bring about Walt Rostow's end of nationhood? Could all of what happened to our nation as a result of this war been the true objectives of Robert McNamara? We have discussed many problems facing our nation, but we have not dwelled on any solutions. And there is even a great deal more that needs to be told, but we hold that for part two of this presentation. For now, let's summarize with a few conclusions. Communism is, at the same time, a complete failure and a monstrous force for evil. Because of outside help, communism has been able to seize over a third of the world's population and over 40 nations, and it continues in its determination to conquer the whole world. For over 50 years, the government of the United States has been supplying communists with both the wherewithal and the diplomatic help they need to carry out their plans. Powerful influences within the United States have been working for decades to merge the United States with Soviet Russia in a communist-style world government. What is being done in the name of the American people is wrong, can be stopped, and must be stopped if we are to remain a free people. This, of course, is where you come in. Well, there are many thousands of Americans already involved in efforts to stop the treachery that is unfolding. Many, many more are needed. Simply put, America needs more of her sons and her daughters to get informed and then get involved. The logical extension of what we have already discussed means more communist power, continued destruction of the sovereignty of our nation, and the end of personal freedom. The John Birch Society's educational program is designed to help ordinary citizens reverse the course that has been set for America. If we are successful, the nation inherited by present-day Americans will endure. If we fail, then we and our children will cease to enjoy the blessings of freedom. We implore you to examine our literature, view more of our video programs, and then join us in our concerted action program. Perhaps the very first thing you can do is to set some time aside right now to see part two of this program. My name is Charles Armour. I am the President and the Chief Executive Officer of the John Birch Society. In the first part of this program, we discussed the startling revelations of former congressional investigator Norman Dodd. In 1953, he was told by the president of the Ford Foundation, a man named Rowan Gaither, that many powerful individuals in America were working under official directives emanating from the White House to bring about a merger of the United States with communism. We noted that a senior State Department official of the 1960s called openly for an end to nationhood, and the U.S. Secretary of Defense talked mysteriously about using our troops in Vietnam for unnamed objectives other than victory. Among the many steps that are indeed leading the United States into a merger with communism, we surveyed United States diplomatic moves that helped communists seize control of Russia, Poland, China, Cuba, and other nations. We saw how American money, equipment, and technology have helped the Soviet Union to build a powerful military force, and how the American people are now heavily taxed for defense against this Soviet threat. And we noted that the current Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Congressman Jim Wright of Texas, has been proudly distributing a lapel pin with crossed U.S. and USSR flags, even while the Soviets' rape of Afghanistan and other communist atrocities continue. And even after Soviet leader Gorbachev, in November of 1987, declared that the Soviet Union is continuing to strive for world domination. We pick up this trail of treachery in the 1970s, when U.S. aid to communism, already an immense help to the world's greatest tyrannical force, grew even more extensively. In 1972, the U.S. Export-Import Bank agreed to finance 45% of the cost of building the huge Kama River truck factory in the heart of the Soviet Union. Another 45% was financed by David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City. The Soviets themselves put up a mere 10% of the cost. The project, begun during the Nixon administration, was carried forward by President Ford's team and was completed during President Carter's term in office. In response to inquiries about the use of American people's money, officials in Washington insisted that the Kama River trucks would only be used within the USSR and for strictly commercial purposes, and that improving the lot of the Russian people would then lessen the potential for war. The Russian people, of course, posed no threat of war to anyone. It was the Soviet government for whom we were building the truck factory that threatened war. Those who tried to point out these obvious truths were either ignored or told to trust the Soviets. It was 1979 when trucks began to roll off the Kama River assembly lines. They had been built with American machine tools, diesel engine technology, computers, electronics, and whatever else was needed to make heavy-duty trucks. The first of these trucks turned out to be designed for military use, and they were used by the Soviets to invade Afghanistan. Industrial Research and Development magazine reported in July of 1980 that some of the Kama River trucks had even been outfitted for use as missile launchers and had been exported from the Soviet Union to Libya, Syria, and Iraq. In addition to trucks, the Kama River plant was also producing armored personnel carriers and the engines for the Soviet T-72 battle tanks. But trucks that ended up as military vehicles are not the only help that went from America to build the Soviet war machine. Industrial Research and Development magazine further reported,
many computers designed for routine lab work can be used to control nuclear weapons production. Laser technology exported for manufacturing purposes can be modified for exotic satellite-killing weapons. Computers for weather forecasting and air traffic control can be programmed to direct missile launchers. Special drill bit machinery for oil and gas exploration can be used to make armor-piercing warheads. The list goes on.
On January 4th, 1980, just a few days after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter announced a ban on exports of all high-technology items to the Soviet Union. The Commerce Department was forced to suspend 900 export licenses and freeze another 400 that were pending. This ban gives a good picture of the amount of sophisticated goods going to the USSR. While many Americans applauded this curtailment of 1,300 instances of high technology trade with the Soviets, the reason for their applause was short-lived. Only 10 weeks later, the president lifted this ban. The Soviets would once again receive sophisticated technical equipment from America, all of it convertible to military use. Even as they continued to ravage Afghanistan, occupy Eastern Europe, train and equip Cubans and Nicaraguans, sponsor terrorists all over the world, foment revolution in Africa, maintain thousands of gulags and other forms of detention camps in the USSR, and wage every kind of war possible against the remaining free nations of the world. In 1979, President Carter presided over the betrayal of two of America's best friends and closest allies. Aiming an incredibly stringent human rights program at the Shah of Iran and at President Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua, but not at the Soviet Russians, Red China, or any communist nation, the Carter administration actually forced both nations into unfriendly hands. In Iran, under the Shah, America had military bases that were also listening posts, tuned in to what was going on in the Soviet Union. Under the Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran closed the bases and became a seat of anti-American fanaticism and an enemy of other nations in the Middle East. The campaign that led to Somoza's demise makes sense only if the overall policy of the United States government seeks a merger of the United States and communism, as Ford Foundation President Rowan Gaither put it back in 1953. Just as the Truman administration has cut off aid to Chiang Kai-shek and betrayed China into communist hands, and just as the Eisenhower administration had sabotaged Fulgencio Batista and betrayed Cuba into communist hands, so did the Carter administration cut off aid to the elected Somoza government and turn that nation over to the communist Sandinista movement. Also, it was the Carter administration that pressured many senators to turn over the American Canal in Panama to the Marxist dictatorship of Omar Torrijos, and to pay his government $400 million to take it. The Carter administration endorsed the SALT II agreement, a treaty so flawed that even the Democratic-controlled Senate would never ratify it. Undaunted, President Carter announced that he would abide by it anyway. The Soviets promptly violated 11 separate provisions of the treaty, and President Reagan continued to abide by this unratified treaty. In 1979, the Carter administration, following the lead of the Nixon and Ford teams before it, withdrew U.S. diplomatic recognition from our Free Chinese ally on Taiwan and gave it to the Red Chinese regime in Peking, the most brutal tyranny in the history of the world. As expected, the flood of propaganda telling Americans that the Chinese communists have changed has been followed by massive increases in shipments of technology, military equipment, and credit, and by the importation into the United States of vast amounts of goods produced by China's slave labor for the benefit of China's communist regime. To many, the arrival of President Ronald Reagan in the White House offered hope that America would reverse decades of harmful foreign policy and put an end to supplying the communists. Only a few days after he took office in 1981, Mr. Reagan was asked at a news conference if he felt that détente was still possible. He responded,
"Well, so far, détente's been a one-way street that the Soviet Union has used to pursue its own aims. I don't have to think of an answer as to what I think their intentions are. They have repeated it. I know of no leader of the Soviet Union since the revolution, and including the present leadership, that has not more than once repeated in various communist congresses they hold their determination that their goal must be the promotion of world revolution and a one-world socialist or communist state, whichever word you want to use. Now, as long as they do that, and as long as they at the same time have openly and publicly declared that the only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to attain that, I think when you do business with them, even as a detente, you keep that in mind.
Instead of ending his statement with, when you do business with them, you keep that in mind, we wish Mr. Reagan had said, that is why we will no longer do business with them. But there was still a great deal about the statement to applaud, and when he later referred to communism as an evil empire, it seemed clear that he included all of the Soviet satellite nations in his harsh but realistic criticism. Yet after only 4 months in office, the president personally signed this document authorizing $120 million loan from the U.S. Export-Import Bank to Communist Romania for the construction of a nuclear power generating facility. 2 weeks later, he signed this document reducing tariffs and other trade barriers between the United States and the communist nations of Romania and Hungary. And a few weeks after that, in July of 1981, he authorized the spending of U.S. taxpayers' money for military education and training for communist Yugoslavia. In February of 1982, Deputy Secretary of Agriculture Richard Ling conceded that the United States was paying Communist Poland's overdue debts to U.S. banks. This gift to Poland, ultimately to the USSR, came just after the Polish armed forces, backed by Soviet troops at the border, had crushed the brief flirtation with freedom begun by Polish workers under the Solidarity movement. The U.S. action saved the Polish regime and destroyed the rekindled hopes of the long oppressed Polish people. No one can study the various programs involving aid to communist nations without noting that the excuse offered for all of it is that these communist governments will become less warlike and more friendly. Yet we even send some of them military hardware. How the Red Chinese, for instance, will become less warlike when we supply them with armaments is never explained. Nor does our assistance make the recipients of our aid more friendly. Consider this. In March of 1985, several U.S. banks and the Bank of Tokyo supplied over $1 billion in loans to communist East Germany. The East Germans turned right around and sent $20 million to the communist Sandinista regime in Nicaragua, the same government the U.S. was supposed to be vigorously opposing. Legislation to make such loans to communist bloc nations illegal was immediately introduced in Congress by Senator Jake Garn of Utah, but it died because of President Reagan's opposition. Another excuse for aid to the communist Chinese holds that it would break the Peking regime away from ties with Moscow. In 1981, President Reagan signed this authorization to supply $57 million of export-import bank money to the Red Chinese for power-generating equipment. In 1982, he signed this authorization for $68 million to help them purchase a steel mill. This is American taxpayers' money being given to a tyrannical communist regime. In 1985, the administration allowed the sale of equipment to enable the Red Chinese to build a factory to produce artillery shells. In 1986, we sold them anti-submarine torpedoes for their warships and electronic equipment that enabled them to modernize their jet fighter planes. Did all of this break Red China away from the Soviets? Did it make the Peking regime more friendly? The Red Chinese answered, but the administration refused to listen. In July of 1985, the Communist Chinese signed a $14 billion trade pact with the Soviet Union. And in September of 1986, they sent a $20 million interest-free loan to Communist Nicaragua. In the single fiscal year of 1985, the United States gave over $300 million to various communist countries through direct foreign aid programs. But during that same year, America helped finance communist regimes with an additional $6 billion channeled through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These are two United Nations lending agencies. There never seems to be an end of the ways that the United States government helps communist regimes. Far from merely tolerating deals with communist nations, the Reagan administration has been an aggressive champion of such practices. In December of 1985, then Secretary of Commerce Malcolm Baldrige led a delegation of 400 American corporate executives on a trade excursion to Moscow. The businessmen represented nearly 200 American firms. News of this trade mission prompted a writer for an Arizona newspaper to seek the names of these individuals and the firms they represented. After 2 years of effort and $20,000 of the newspaper's money for Freedom of Information Act requests and court costs, the frustrated journalist admitted defeat. The United States government would not allow those names to be made public. In June of 1973, President Nixon and Soviet General Secretary Brezhnev signed an agreement that led to the formation of the United States USSR Trade and Economic Council, known as USTEC. Its purpose was to expand trade between the two countries. Then Secretary of Treasury George Shultz helped to create the group, with 26 U.S. businessmen and 26 Soviet officials as its board of directors. USTEC opened an office in New York City in 1973. Hundreds of U.S. firms have been recruited, and business of helping the USSR is booming. One of the founders and eventual co-chairman of USTEC is C. William Verity, named late in 1987 by President Reagan to be the Secretary of Commerce. During Senate hearings on the Verity nomination in October of 1987, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina described USTEC as, quote, quite simply an arm of the Soviet government under KGB control, whose purpose is to subvert the United States economy, end of quote. Helms said Verity was, quote, a key agent of influence for Soviet trade, end of quote. While expressing a strong opposition to the nomination, Senator Helms indicted Verity as one who seeks, quote, an ultimate convergence or merging of the United States and the Soviet Union into a common culture, economy, philosophy, and despotism, end of quote. Only 2 months later, in December of 1987, Senator Helms spoke out again, this time in opposition to the Reagan-Gorbachev disarmament treaty. He repeated his denunciation of those who seek first to build communism and then to merge the United States with the Soviet Union in a new world order. And he condemned the members of what he termed the insiders clubs, naming such organizations as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, England's Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Aspen Institute of Humanistic Studies, and the Federal Reserve System. The merger, repeatedly condemned by Senator Helms in 1987, is exactly what Rowan Gaither boldly outlined to Norman Dodd over 30 years ago. It is obviously much closer to reality today. Numerous individuals have sought to obtain USTEC membership lists. Once again, despite spending thousands of dollars and going through the formality of filing Freedom of Information Act requests, they have been totally unsuccessful. Again, the Soviets knew who these individuals are. They deal with them for American products. And our own government knows who they are because USTEC, in many ways, is an arm of the United States government established by government officials. But the American people are not permitted to know the identity of all of the red traders. Nevertheless, some firms participating in USTEC have been identified. They are Allen Bradley, Alice Chalmers, American Express, Archer Daniels Midland, Armco Steel, Cargill, Caterpillar, Chase Manhattan, Coca-Cola, Deere & Company, Dow Chemical, Dresser Industries, E.I. DuPont, Ingersoll Rand, International Harvester, Kodak, Monsanto, Occidental Petroleum, PepsiCo, Union Carbide, and Xerox. And we have good reason to believe that there are hundreds of others engaging in Soviet trade. Senator Helms also took the occasion during the Verity hearings to blast for their efforts with USTEC David Rockefeller of Chase Manhattan Bank, Dwayne Andreas of Archer Daniels Midland, and Armand Hammer of Occidental Petroleum. Labeling their efforts a cabal, the senator included these men in his description of those who were working for, quote, a merging of the United States and the Soviet Union into a common culture, economy, philosophy, and despotism, end of quote. His mention of David Rockefeller is certainly appropriate. No one has done more to help the Soviet Union than this billionaire banker and political manipulator. In a revealing article, Rockefeller wrote for the October-November 1977 USTEC Journal, where he boasted,
It is of interest to recall that at the Chase Manhattan Bank, we can look back to an unbroken relationship with Russian financial institutions that straddles over 50 years. The commercial banking relationship of our institution was never interrupted, even in the darkest days.
In 1982, David Rockefeller visited communist-held Angola, a nation whose red leaders are kept in power by tens of thousands of Cuban troops and their Soviet advisors. Rockefeller later told the press that the communist presence in Angola had not interfered with his own banking relationship. He stated, quote, we have found we can deal with just about any kind of government, provided that they are orderly and responsible, end of quote. The kind of order and responsibility he seeks can be found in the Soviet Union, Red China, and other communist countries. For years, the United States government has committed our nation to various U.S., USSR disarmament treaties. Sold to the American people as a method of forestalling nuclear war, these treaties have all been broken by the Soviet Union while they have been honored by the United States. Each new treaty amounts to a further exercise in unilateral disarmament. We disarm and they cheat. If disarmament were really our own government's goal, the U.S. could put a stop to the flow of strategic goods, high technology equipment, and money that the Soviets need to build their weapons. But help to the Kremlin has not only continued, it has increased. We can't stress this point too heavily. Disarming the Soviets and reducing the threat of nuclear war can be accomplished by stopping all U.S. aid and trade to communist nations. And the related and equally important point is that signing disarmament treaties with the Soviets disarms only the United States, because our nation honors the various treaties. We are being reduced to a position where the loss of our sovereignty and the merger with communist nations in a one-world tyranny will be presented to the American people as the best available alternative in a hostile world. Foreign Affairs is a very prestigious publication, the journal of the establishment's pinnacle of power, the World Government Promoting Council on Foreign Relations. It should never be ignored. Its pages carry important elements of the strategy of one-world merger maniacs. It is in this quarterly magazine that tactics are suggested and attitudes are forged. In April 1974, at the time when David Rockefeller served as chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs published a remarkably frank proposal for doing away with United States sovereignty. Authored by Columbia University professor and veteran State Department official Richard N. Gardner, the article was entitled, "The Hard Road to World Order, It began with Gardner expressing his disappointment that like-minded internationalists had failed to achieve what he termed instant world government. For a new and more effective route to the creation of an all-powerful superstate, he offered,
In short, the House of World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion, to use William James's famous description of reality, but an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault.
as a more efficient way to form the House of World Order, Gardner suggested luring all nations into a variety of technological, economic, and political entanglements. The first 3 of 10 he listed were the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. Membership of the various nations of the world in these and other organizations would, according to this prominent internationalist, facilitate the erosion of national sovereignty and speed the development of his longed-for world government. In the process, of course, it's goodbye to the independence of the United States of America. It cannot be stated too emphatically. Anyone holding the Gardner view would not be able honestly to swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Both the IMF and the World Bank were conceived at the famous Bretton Woods Monetary Conference held in New Hampshire during July of 1944. The chief architect of each was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the United States, Harry Dexter White, who was later shown to have been a Soviet spy. Ostensibly, the World Bank was created to provide loans to member nations for the purpose of reconstruction and development after World War II. The IMF's stated purpose is to stimulate international trade and promote stability in the realm of international currency exchange. But the effects of these two multinational financial institutions, both United Nations agencies, were analyzed in 1963 by respected political columnist Dan Smoot. Cutting through all of the propaganda, Smoot said that the two agencies would, 1, strip the United States of its gold reserves, 2, build up the industrial capacities of other nations at U.S. expense, 3, remove markets from American producers, 4, entwine America's affairs with those of other nations so that the U.S. could no longer act independently. And this is exactly what happened. Though all of the blame for what has occurred cannot be laid at the doorstep of the IMF and the World Bank, the two agencies deserve much of it. The United States has supplied tens of billions of dollars to these international banks. Each of them act much like a credit union whose members can borrow from its pool of funds. The U.S. supplies over 20% of these funds. As of the end of 1987, there were 151 member nations in both the IMF and the World Bank. Virtually all communist nations, but not the Soviet Union, were members. In fiscal year 1985, these two money spigots doled out the following amounts to communist nations. Red China, $2.3 billion. Yugoslavia, $1.7 billion. Hungary, $1.1 billion. Romania, $768.3 million. Zimbabwe, $293.6 million. Angola, $116.2 million. Vietnam, $111.8 million. Mozambique, $107.9 million. And Nicaragua, $36.8 million. As we mentioned, the Gardner proposal in Foreign Affairs magazine also called for using the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to build world government. Begun in 1948, GATT takes from its member nations their own decision-making process in the vital areas of international trade relations. Despite warnings that the U.S. membership had the potential to affect adversely the jobs and income of every worker and farmer in America, Congress approved U.S. entry into the group at its birth. Many of the problems facing individual Americans, even the problems of our nation's commerce as a whole, can be traced to GATT, where we have only a single vote among the 95 member nations. Early in 1988, President Reagan completely reversed one of his long-standing positions and announced support for the USSR's desire to gain membership in the IMF, the World Bank, and GATT. Membership in the two banking institutions will allow the Soviets to obtain vitally needed hard currency and also enhance the USSR's ability to acquire additional private credit. Membership in GATT will help the Soviets to improve their trading position in Western markets, and especially to help them gain access to more high-technology goods. The Reagan reversal greatly adds to the power and the prestige of these international agencies, dramatically improves the lot of the economically strapped Soviet Union, and mounts to a significant leap along Professor Gardner's hard road to New World Order. It also fits exactly into the strategy of tearing the U.S. down and building the Soviet Union and other nations up, and finally, merging all into a neatly arranged world tyranny. In the spring 1988 issue of Foreign Affairs, Gardner repeated his proposal for doing away with our nation's sovereignty. Still promoting the World Bank, the IMF, and GATT as the means to accomplish this goal, he now recommends what he calls practical internationalism. It is more of the same treasonous betrayal of the independence of our nation and the freedom of the American people. A significant new development in the unconscionable drive to help the Soviet Union is the joint venture program. American firms are being pressured by the Commerce Department and USTEC to build factories in the USSR. America's corporate giants would be permitted by the Soviets to only own as much as 49% of each facility they erect, and it would be presided over by a Soviet national. The lure of great profits has already attracted large American firms who have been USTEC's major participants for years. The opportunity for the Soviets to gain access to American technology and the fruits of free enterprise with little or no investment on their part has the Kremlin's tyrants raising their vodka glasses to toast their good fortune. More toast surely accompanied the announcement that a team from Harvard University's prestigious business school had joined with a team of Soviet researchers to facilitate this joint venture project. The announced purpose is to aid the USSR to modernizing its backward economy with Western investments. Of particular interest to the Soviets are the joint ventures in the high technology area. Then in April 1988, 7 major U.S. firms announced the formation of the American Trade Consortium to speed the joint venture program. The firms involved are Ford Motor Company, Eastman Kodak, Chevron Oil, RJR Nabisco, Johnson & Johnson, Archer Daniels Midland, and Mercator Corporation, the merchant banker for the group. There seems to be a giddy kind of compulsion on the part of these industrialists to sacrifice every imaginable principle and every patriotic sentiment in order to help the Soviet Union and make some profits. All of these champions of aid and trade for communism conveniently ignore the stark reality of the Soviet Empire. Mikhail Gorbachev and his colleagues are personally responsible for the murders of millions in Afghanistan and Ethiopia. Their predecessors murdered tens of millions elsewhere. It is the Soviet Union's totalitarian rule that keeps hundreds of millions caged behind barbed wire and concrete walls where there is no freedom of speech, assembly, or religion, no property rights, and no say in government. We are told over and over again that Gorbachev is different. But he is different only in a public relations sense. And the greatest publicity agents for his Glasnost campaign are the chieftains of America's media. But even if many Americans are swayed by the pro-Gorbachev media blitz, there is no reason to believe that America's government officials and corporate executives are being deceived. For them, the phony Glasnost campaign is an excuse to propel our nation and the whole world into the unholy merger with communism. That is their true goal. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, many Americans continue to believe that so-called capitalists from the West are the arch-enemies of communists. Over and over, we hear confused citizens taking solace in the belief that our own leaders, in government and in business, would never sell out to communism and harm America because they would have so much to lose should America become a communist or socialist state. And yet, this is exactly what is happening right before their eyes. The very leaders who supposedly would never do what they have indeed been doing for decades do not believe in freedom for all, just freedom for themselves and their pals at the top. Calling them capitalists is not enough. They are monopoly capitalists. The logical extension of their cooperation with communism and their promotion of big brother government at home is the destruction of the free market system in America and the creation of a socialist economy. Would these corporate socialists lose anything? Not at all. They would end up with no more wants than Gorbachev or any of the other elitists who sit atop the Soviet Empire. In fact, they would be better off in their way of looking at things, for they would no longer face any threat of competition. Their allies in government would see to that. This is the mentality of those who aid the Soviet Union through Ustek. This is the mentality of the Harvard Business School. It is what Senator Helms meant when he condemned the Rockefeller Andreas Hammer Verity School of Thought, that he said is working for, quote, a merging of the United States and the Soviet Union into a common culture, economy, philosophy, and despotism, end of quote. Capitalists oppose communism. Those who truly believe in freedom despise communism and want nothing to do with it. But there are others who have no qualms whatsoever about cooperating with communists or using ruthless means, usually with the government's assistance, to drive potential competitors out of existence. These are the people who seek only what's good for business, not what's good for the country or what's just plain good. Look at the prestigious Wall Street Journal. On August 24th, 1987, this seed of American capitalism published a 9-page advertising supplement for the Soviet Union. Labeled USSR, New Opportunities for Cooperation, the spread touts the advantages of trade with the Soviet Union. A tear-out, Reader's Response Form, directs interested parties to send inquiries about buying Soviet goods not to Moscow, but to journal offices around the globe. Obviously, by becoming an agent for the USSR, the Wall Street Journal's leaders have chosen to ignore the Soviet Union's unbroken record of lying, cheating, enslaving, and murdering that has earned it the distinction of being the most powerful force for evil in the history of mankind. For $350,000 in advertising revenue, the capitalists at the Wall Street Journal have entered into a loose partnership with and supplied a priceless amount of dignity to the world's premier criminal regime. When the U.S. government decides to act decisively, it makes things happen. In 1983, a lightning-quick invasion of the tiny island nation of Grenada deposed a militant communist regime in a matter of days. But communism in Cuba is never threatened. And the Red regime in Nicaragua has actually benefited from years of half-hearted opposition. When America turned on several heads of state who wanted to be friends, the Shah of Iran, Somoza in Nicaragua, Ian Smith in Rhodesia, and others, embargoes and sanctions were effectively employed. Today, the U.S. government imposes sanctions on South Africa and applies a variety of pressures against Chile. More nations that want to be friendly but received the back of our hand. These targeted nations, whatever their problems, never in any way could be compared with any communist tyranny. But for communist nations, our demands are few, and our gestures of friendliness include subsidized grain sales, sophisticated equipment and technology transfers, foreign aid, IMF and World Bank loans, export-import bank credits, and most favored nation status, all at the expense of the United States taxpayer and all at the expense of human freedom. At home, the American people are propagandized into favoring interdependence instead of independence, globalism instead of the wonders of our constitutional republic, government regulations and controls instead of economic freedom, peace at any price instead of honorable defense of liberty and property, and cohabitation with gangster regimes instead of refusal to have anything to do with them. At their summit meeting in Geneva in November of 1985, President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev signed a broad range of cultural agreements that included exchanging instructors and courses for all levels of education, even down to the primary grades. One of the agreements, authored by educational experts from both nations, details plans to use computer technology to restructure the education of young children beginning in the 3rd grade. This joint educational venture calls for the U.S. to supply the computers, while the Soviets write the courses. Yes, you heard correctly. The Soviet educators, all of whom are government agents, will be writing courses for American school children. It ought to be obvious to anyone that America is being changed. At the same time, even with its new public relations face, the Soviet Union has not deviated an inch from its evil goals. The sinister plan to merge the U.S. with the Soviet Union has dominated our nation's foreign policy for decades. Once this plan is known, all of the many pro-communist and self-defeating actions of our leaders can be both understood and combated. But merging the United States with communism could never be accomplished without remarkable changes within America's borders. Before a U.S.-USSR merger could be accomplished, the American people would have to be forced into dependence on government, and many of them have already arrived at such a state. Taxation would have to be increased to the point where a great number of Americans became conditioned to believing that government had a legitimate claim on everything they own, and that it is government's benevolence that allows them to retain some income, some property, and some rights. And many have arrived at this view as well. These people have adopted the views contained in the Communist Manifesto, whether they realize it or not. There are millions of Americans today who think that government should redistribute the wealth, provide cradle-to-grave security, control business and supply education and child care, even down to the age of infants. This is all communist thinking. Many billions believe that no matter what the problem is, it ought to be solved by government. They know little of the reasons why our nation became independent, and they could care less. They accept totalitarian views and never consider where these views will lead. One good example of a frightening change is the widespread acceptance of government-sponsored affirmative action programs. Affirmative action presupposes that rights belong to a group, not to an individual. If you belong to the favored group, you are entitled to favored treatment. Never mind individual talent or ability. What group do you belong to? There could hardly be a more un-American and Marxist attitude. But like so much of what is infecting America, it has become widely accepted. Government at every level operates on the presumption that it has the power in every area except those few where laws have barred its presence. Thus, government has become virtually omnipresent. But the American system given us by wise and courageous men over 200 years ago clearly states that government may act only where it specifically is authorized to do so. What we live under today bears little resemblance to what our founding fathers gave us, but is becoming strikingly similar to the system advocated by Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Merging the America of our founding fathers with communism is impossible, but merging the perverted contemporary system with red tyranny becomes more and more possible every day. The picture we have been painting is one of conspiracy. There is a plan. It seeks to accomplish an evil end. Its ultimate goal remains hidden in the shadows, and there are certainly more than a few persons involved. All of the ingredients of conspiracy are present, but the American people have also been encouraged to classify any suggestion of conspiracy as a complete absurdity. We are reminded of the very cogent observation which holds that the first job of a conspiracy is to convince the world it does not exist. One aspect of our conclusion about conspiracy that many have never considered is that of hope. If instead of deliberate hidden treachery, all of what we have recounted is the product of some evolutionary forces, who can stop it? If there is no conspiracy promoting all of it, where is there any hope of reversing the horrifying trend? But there is a conspiracy, and all that is needed to stop its deadly progress is enough courage in enough Americans to expose it. In other words, there is hope. We can stop communist progress. We can save our country, and we can pass along our legacy of liberty to our children. Most Americans don't want our government to aid communism. Most don't want government dominating their lives. Most want lower taxes and less government control. Most want to be judged by their own abilities, not classified as part of some group. In other words, the vast majority of Americans don't want what is happening. They want the America that our founding fathers gave us. They are our allies, waiting to be informed and given hope that the future can indeed be a future of freedom. What then should be done about what is happening to America? The answer boils down to exposure. If enough Americans can be made aware of what is being done to our own country and what is being done to other nations and other peoples by our own government, the sinister plans of this conspiracy will collapse. If more Americans will demand of our leaders that they cease providing aid, trade, credits, technology, and legitimacy to all communist nations, the conspiracy will be dealt a huge blow. Communism does not have to be fought. It merely has to be isolated. It's high time we stopped helping communism. Here, there, or anywhere, as the John Birch Society petition to the United States Congress asks. If more Americans will demand of our leaders that our nation withdraw from the sovereignty-destroying United Nations and make independence, not interdependence, their goal, the conspiracy will be dealt another huge blow. There is nothing wrong and plenty right about national sovereignty. If a great many Americans can be brought to a realization that the mass media is at least deficient and at worst deliberately misleading, then the conspiracy that relies so heavily on the American people being given a daily dose of misinformation will suffer another crippling blow. The tiny percentage that wants to make America a single province in a communist or socialist world tyranny is winning. Mainly because the great majority of Americans who want to know what is happening and why are misinformed and ill-informed. As soon as the great American awakening takes place, political leaders, educators, media personality, and befuddled Americans in every walk of life will begin to see things in a remarkably different way. Most of the conspiracy's work has always been done for it by individuals who are either unaware of whose ball they are really carrying or who promote ideas and causes merely to advance their own careers. With more good Americans waking the town and telling the people, some of these individuals can be reclaimed, and others will begin to do what is right when they realize that doing so will bring even greater rewards than they are reaping at the present. For several decades, the principles that have undergirded the greatness of America have been subjected to a massive assault. Independence has been portrayed as warmongering. Limited government has been likened to selfishness. The Constitution is supposed to be a relic of the outmoded past. Morality has been made to seem old-fashioned and stupid. Traditional family values, especially the roles of wives and mothers, have been scorned. The fast buck and the fast life have been glorified. And for far too long, the way to get ahead in politics has been to turn left, cut corners, and play along. Isn't it time for all of this to be reversed? Isn't it time for you to get informed and get involved? What can you do? Subscribe to a truly pro-American publication like The New American. Help to introduce it to others. There is no other magazine in our nation like The New American. Do your homework. Read good books, articles, and pamphlets. Get others to do the same. There is a tremendous amount of good, solid material available. Pledge to yourself right now that you will get it and put it to work. Obtain and circulate excellent videotapes about our nation's heritage, the decline of education, the attack on U.S. sovereignty, and many other topics. Join with others in sponsoring local efforts to reach the populace with the truth about what is happening to America. The organized approach, both nationally and locally, will magnify any individual effort. The John Birch Society needs your help, and you need the John Birch Society. We are asking you and many more Americans to assist us, not only in putting out one or two of the many fires that are destroying our nation. We are asking your help to stop the arsonists who are setting the fires. The job can be done, it must be done, and everyone can help. And when America is freed from the grip of the conspiracy that would merge us with a monstrous evil and destroy our liberty, those who freed her will have earned the gratitude of their countrymen as well as the thanks of millions who suffer under communist tyranny all over the world. Do you have what it takes? We hope so. We hope that thousands more and then tens of thousands beyond them will recognize that America, still the best hope of mankind for freedom and opportunity, is being destroyed. Not by Russians or Chinese or Cubans, but by an enemy from within that has gained a frightening degree of control over government, mass media, education, and a great deal more. No member of the John Birch Society ever wants to say, "I told you so," after all hope has been destroyed and our nation no longer exists. And surely no real American ever wants to have to answer a child who asks, "What happened to America?" We know that practically all who will view this program do care and do want to pass on the great heritage of freedom and opportunity that we were fortunate enough to inherit. What must be done can be done, and you, because you have the influence, if only you will use it, can participate. Join with tens of thousands who are already working in the John Birch Society and help us to turn a world gone crazy back to sanity once again.